Here we go. Welcome, everyone.
Hi.
Yep, so Mandy and Richard, take it away.
Okay. I believe I got the honor to get started today. So just a small little piece about me. I am Mandy Reavis. I am the Assistant Director with the Catawba County Historical Association, and I'm also a Professor of History at Lenore-Rhyne. I wanted to start actually a little bit before the work towards women's suffrage. We tend to kind of pick up at Seneca Falls, and we'll definitely hit on that in a little bit. But I want to back us up a little bit because we tend to leave out the struggle before the movement. So I'm sorry.
I'm going to mute people who are not muted.
I have ADD, so the minute I hear somebody talking, I assume somebody's trying to flag me down and tell me I've missed something. So in 1776, really the only folks who were allowed to vote were landowning white men. So it was a very restricted vote at the time. And we don't really see much change there until 1856, when the vote is expanded to all white men, whether you own land or not. So we see almost 100 years where voting rights were even more restricted than we tend to kind of talk about when we're looking at the larger women's suffrage movement. So we go a very, very long time still after that before we actually see the 19th Amendment come about. But in 1872 is when we start to see women kind of say something really needs to get going here. I'm skipping Seneca Falls. I'll come back to that. And we start seeing women actually going out and voting, which is against the law. And so I don't want to jump too far out of head here, but I want you to keep this little section in mind in 1872 when we talk about some of the more current voting rights struggles that we've had that have involved law enforcement and people being restricted. Richard, do you have anything you want to start out with?
Well, no, to go back to your point about 1776, the idea amongst the founding fathers, well, they really punted on this idea of who could vote and who could not vote. And where they were going with it is they left it really open to the states. But the idea was that if you were a property landowner, then you had some skin in the game. You had a reason to vote. You had a reason to make sure that your vote was a prudent one, not something that you just, kind of crazily do. And so at that point, you were really kind of vested in the society. And, that's really how it went all the way up through up to, as Mandy said, the 1850s, when it was universal male suffrage. But then you've got that whole next step of where you go from there. And that's going to, that's going to get really wrapped up. I don't want to give away anything that Mandy's going to say, but it really gets wrapped up in the whole civil rights. And you really can't think of women's voting rights as part of the civil rights movement. We generally don't tend to think of it that way, but it really goes hand in hand with the classic era of civil rights of the 13th, 14th, and then most to our question here, the 15th Amendment, as to who gets the right to vote.
Absolutely. So we've got kind of an idea of where we're going with this. I will go ahead and take us over to Seneca Falls. That is everyone's favorite little piece of women's suffrage history. It makes a great story. It really does. So if you're unfamiliar, Seneca Falls was a convention that was held in New York in 1848. There are about 300 activists who actually met to discuss what women's rights should be. There were male involved, there were females involved. It was a pretty decent showing. It was a very, very heavily white convention. So this is something that is pointed out a lot in history books, is we really don't see, Richard, correct me if I'm wrong, anyone other than Frederick Douglass there to represent people of color. Yeah. So it is a very, very limited convention, but for its time to have 300 folks be willing to show up and discuss what women's rights are or could possibly become was something that was very significant. What I found interesting when I was doing a little bit of research was not that Seneca Falls didn't start out as a convention to discuss whether or not women would be able to vote. It was the broader women's rights, which of course suffrage and voting was a part of. And the ability or the allowance of women to vote was actually one of the things that the convention was unable to agree on. So everything else that they had talked about more or less had a universal everyone agreed to it. And then you hit the actual voting rights issues, and it was unagreed. And that was on both male and female counterparts. There were several different arguments that we'll get to later about why people opposed women's voting, but there were male and females who both said, you know, I'm not okay with that. We're not going to do it. And so even leaving a Seneca Falls convention about women's rights, we weren't able to come up with a true agreement on whether or not that should be legally allowed.
Yeah, in some ways, I think it's because it was of all the there's like 10 or 11, propositions, resolutions that they adopted, and I think that's the one that most people thought, well, there's no way that's going to happen. It was just way too radical for the time to even think about that, because women lacked, and this goes all the way up until 1920. Women lacked in a lot of ways personhood on a national basis. I tell classes that really, if you were a woman, you were the domain of your father until you were married. Then you were the property of your husband, or he took control of you. And then if your husband died, then you went to the son or son-in-law if you only had girls. And the only way that you were recognized in any way as a person is if there were absolutely no male there to I know this sounds terrible, but to take responsibility for you.
Absolutely right. Whether it was the ability to own property or even have custody of your children, men had full legal autonomy over women at that point in time. So you're absolutely right. The idea that a woman could vote on her own was just absolutely absurd. And there are several different reasons, not just the legal aspect of it, but women were looked at as uneducated and kind of silly. They were there to be moral guidance, not someone necessarily to vote. And if the woman felt strongly, then she should just influence her husband to vote on her behalf, more or less. So there was definitely a divide between the vote, for sure.
Yeah, and when you get to the industrial age, you've got that whole idea of two separate spheres, that men handle the public sphere, which is politics and the workaday world and all the brutal stuff, and women handle the home front, which is the children and the nurturing. And it was the idea that this was ordained by God, that if you read in the Bible, there were supposed to be separate men's and women's roles, and if one wandered into the other area, that was just that was just going to disrupt the whole society. What really kind of blows my mind is how it goes into the industrial age, and this idea that if a woman drew a paycheck from a factory, she went to work for a factory just like her husband did, that she doesn't get the paycheck, he does.
Isn't that grand?
Wait a minute. As the only male, right? Well, no.
I will throw in with industrialism as well. The other fear was women as nurturers were concerned for the welfare of their children and other children, typically. And a lot of industrial and manufacturing labor came from child labor. So that was another fear of women having the right to vote, is that there would be regulations put in on these manufacturings and textile businesses, that they would lose the ability to have children working. The advantage of child labor is you can pay them a lot less, and their tiny little fingers and small bodies can get into these machines and do things that larger folks couldn't do. So if they lost the ability to have children laborers, businesses were going to face a lot of issues. And so that was one of the biggest proponents.
Mandy, and
yes,
is that exactly what happened?
What do you mean? I'm sorry.
They were afraid that they would lose the ability to hire children, or and then women got the vote, and then that is exactly what happened. They lost the ability to hire children.
It is exactly what happened. It not quite linearly. It took a little bit of doing, and it wasn't just women. Richard, you might know a little bit more on the manufacturing side than I do with some of your research.
Yeah, it's about 15 years before it's declared unconstitutional. But, you could argue that women going into the factory actually brought those kids into the factory as well, because kids needing somebody to take care of them would follow their mother. And then when they'd show up at the factory with nothing to do, the foreman would say, here, carry this bucket or sweep this floor. And that helped to facilitate women in the workplace, children in the workplace. And, whereas we look at it as an evil, in some ways, people looked at it as a social good, because you are training these children for a job. I mean, with a lot of them, the idea of an education beyond learning their letters and their numbers, it was out of the question. They weren't going to go to college. So this prepared them. So a lot of people said when women go into the workforce, yeah, not such a bad thing because they're bringing their kids along with them. And those kids are contributing in most industrial settings. Those kids are contributing to the family coffers, just like the wife is. Of course, the husband controlled all that.
Absolutely. One thing that I like to talk about is the way that history has kind of looked back on the women's suffrage movement. Is it feels like a unified movement, that all of the women of the nation were working towards this and they were doing the same things and they felt the same way, or at least all of the white women. But that is actually not the case in the way that it started. So there were two different factions, and that is the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association, that took very different viewpoints on how to progress and what action should be taken. So the divide splits on the issue of whether or not African American men should be given the right to vote before a white woman would receive the right to vote. And so that's where we see kind of the nation, or the women's nation, divide. So the National Women's Suffrage Association, that is led more or less by Susan B. Anthony. There's a lot of people in there, but everybody knows Susan had worked tirelessly. And they felt that white women should be given the right to vote before African American men. And that more or less, if we divide and we start focusing on the 15th Amendment, then possibly we end up taking away the importance of women having the right to vote. And then we have the American Women's Suffrage Association, who felt differently. And they said that our goal is to get everyone the right to vote. And if that means women are on the back burner right now, then we can all work together in the future. And so it was a different picture than necessarily some of your schools have been taught and so on. You have to condense things as much as you can in a curriculum, but it was not this unified movement that we tend to think of when we think of women's suffrage.
Yeah, because eventually it goes to a good cop, bad cop kind of thing, with, you know, the Alice Paul militants being so far out there. And, you know, she learned from the Pankhurst over in England when they were trying to get the vote. And, you know, that makes the, and I get them mixed up, National Women's, the Katie Chapman Catt,
Yes.
Carrie Chapman Catt. Her organization seemed tame by comparison. But, you know, the interesting thing is, to me, the pivotal figure here is Frederick Douglass, who is very much a supporter of women having the vote. But when it comes down to the 15th Amendment, he makes the argument that and I'm using a quote from him here, it is the Negro's hour. And so it seems as though the country is not ready. We'll never know, because we don't, you know, you don't get to play these things twice. But if the country was ready for actually two revolutions, which is former slaves and African Americans being given full citizenship right alongside women getting the right to vote, was that too much for especially the South to be able to handle? You know, that was the argument that was being made there.
And we don't see a whole lot change out of that for the next several decades, of the idea of who's going to be able to get the vote and what can the nation handle. We see Native Americans being informed that they're not citizens, so they have no right to vote. We have various different things come about. The Chinese Exclusion Act says that Chinese cannot become citizens and they can't vote. We have similar things come about for the Japanese. So there are very numerous things coming about that is limiting the right to vote instead of expanding it throughout these decades. We do see those two groups actually come together in about the turn of the century, almost 1900, and we start to see something kind of develop as far as a unified national suffrage movement. And as Richard mentioned, Carrie Chapman Catt, she ends up kind of the head of the entire group there, and they really start kind of, well, would you say unifying, Richard, or am I being too kind to history on there?
Yeah, I think you're being too kind.
Too kind.
Because, you know, there are strict divisions here about what people believe. That, you know, it's as we all are. You want your group to get there first, whoever that group is you represent. But, you know, as far as the reason why we see less voting by greater numbers than more is also partially because of the influx of immigrants. And so your propertied white males, you know, of the new industrial age of the South getting into that, are arguing that you have to be responsible. I mean, that's why you can see disenfranchisement of African Americans is the argument that they need to be able to read, thus literacy tests, need to be able to pay for the privilege to vote, thus poll taxes, all those sort of things. We now look at it as the more people get to vote, the better. But they saw it as almost like a privilege that you had, that you needed to know as much as you possibly could about the events so that you could make an intelligent vote. A vote wasn't just a vote needed to be an intelligent vote. And so that's why you see the exclusion of all these people.
But don't we see some of that today? I'm not sure everybody agrees that everybody should be able to vote.
Oh, very much so. I see what you're saying. Yes.
Yeah, it's something that throughout history, we still have the issue of who do we consider good enough to vote, for lack of a better way to word that, whether we're talking about someone who has a felony on their record or someone whose skin is perhaps a different color. It's something that there are people who just 100% have differing beliefs on that.
Well, and the other thing I would argue, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'd have to disagree with that.
Which part?
Felons, illegal immigrants voting in the United States of America.
We're saying that people disagree on that. We weren't necessarily saying that you should feel one way or the other. Just saying that the United States is very
I would be one that would disagree on that.
Okay.
Oh. But the point I was going to make was that even amongst the women's movement, because people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton was arguing when it was a choice between African American males or white women to vote, she was saying that a lot of African American males hadn't read the Constitution, therefore they weren't steeped in the issues, and that a lot of white women had, so therefore white women deserve the right to vote over African American males, which both of them are vying for that right, and it almost as though that the white male hierarchy had pitted one against the other. I don't say consciously, but that's kind of how it turned out to look like.
Richard, would you say you see more of a, I don't want to use the word unification, but do you see more of a common denominator by the time we hit around World War I era and we see President Wilson actually step out and say that he even endorses women's suffrage at that point? Do you think that more of the country came behind and stood behind the women's vote at that point? Or do you still see that divide there at that point?
Well, you really see the divide in the approaches of the women's movement. Alice Paul with her very militant hunger strikes when she's in jail and the government putting her in jail for protesting against that, versus a Katie Chapman Catt, much smoother, trying to become Wilson's friend and that sort of thing. But where I really think there's an interesting beginning here is in 1890 when Wyoming gives women the right to vote, because that's the first state that is kind of bucking the trend and says women deserve the right to vote. And I guess it's, is Jeanette Rankin Wyoming or is she Montana?
She's Wyoming.
She's Wyoming. Okay, so in that, you have the seeds for not only women being able to vote, but women participating directly, like Jeanette Rankin did, in government, becoming a member of the House of Representatives. And then you start adding those states. And once you get to, what is it, like 11 of them, Kansas, Oklahoma, California, Nevada, Oregon, Washington, all of those Western states giving women the right to vote, I think that builds some real momentum for the fact that this should be considered a national issue instead of just a state's issue, that piecemeal. Because correct me if I'm wrong, but the last time I had checked on this, North Carolina never ratified the 19th Amendment. Is that true?
I actually wrote it down so that I wouldn't forget. They don't actually do it until 1971 was the adoption, and I think that's as far as we ever made it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny.
We at least weren't last.
I'm sorry?
We at least weren't last. Mississippi is last.
Okay. All right.
We actually could have been
in the upper south.
We could have been the heroes like Tennessee and be the last ones to actually ratify and get things through. And then we waited till 1971 instead. So we chose a different route than that. Yeah.
Yeah. As a woman in North Carolina, I don't know if y'all still feel that or not, but it's there.
Yes, Jenny?
Could it be that because of the western states, Utah, Wyoming, and all that, you had more male deaths. Therefore, women became property owners more so than in the South.
Yeah, I would
Yeah,
think
I
so.
think so. Yeah, I agree, because women are more vital to the economy in the West, and like you say, where men are, dying off in larger percentage than they are, say, maybe in the East. That women become heads of households, and so therefore
Right.
you need that participation.
Mhm.
Something else that is, I thought, just a very interesting small little tidbit of history here is how the Mormon faith out west actually influenced the woman's right to vote. People tend to think that Mormons tend to be a very conservative type religion, but they actually were very, very vocal that women should have the right to have their own vote. So before really anyone else, the women of Mormon faith actually were able to express their rights. And so that kind of spread. And I just think that's something that was, before I had started researching the topic, that was not anything that I was familiar with.
Yeah, and the other thing I think is in 1917, when New York, of all states, when New York allows women the right to vote, I think that really turned the corner on the idea of it becoming a national issue. Because you remember at the time, New York's still the most populous state of the Union. And
Right.
as New York goes, most of the rest of New England, or New England up above it, tends to go. Now, you're never going to get the South. And now I think that's what really, for the drama of this, that's what makes Tennessee such a fun thing to look at in terms of them being number 36. Because who'd ever think that?
That would be Tennessee. Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, the only way it could have been wilder if it was Mississippi or South Carolina. Yeah.
I will say I've mentioned a couple times about ideas becoming unified later on, but I'm leaving something out that I definitely want to address. And that was, we're still excluding Black women from the movement at this point. So there are several African-American women suffragists that honestly I wish I knew more about. And it's something that I've got on my list of things I'm going to research and become a better advocate about. But we have women like Sojourner Truth and Ida B. Wells who are being excluded from these same types of movements. Sojourner Truth, much like Susan B. Anthony, also attempted to vote in the 1872 election. She wasn't allowed to. She was turned away. And this was despite her involvement in President Grant's campaign to get elected. She was still, of course, not allowed to vote. To the point where in 1901 and in 1903, the National Women's Suffrage Association was holding a convention for women's suffrage, and they explicitly excluded Black suffragists from being involved. So this was something that was an intentional division, that was, this is not for you, this is our battle that we're fighting. And it was an extremely exclusionary convention, which just was something that you would think, in these day and ages, we would almost assume that this would be something that would be more unified, but the division between race was still there, and it was still very strong.
Yeah, even some of the parades that they had, I think it was, might have been the one in DC, where Ida B. Wells comes to be a part of it and was invited to be a part of it. And when she gets there, she finds out she can't march because Washington is a southern city. Now, eventually she does with the Illinois delegation, but they were going to put her in the back of the line. And it does call into question this whole idea that folks like Alice Paul and Kat were faced with, is if you absolutely insist African American women are part of it, does it so load down the 19th Amendment as to make it make it a non-starter, make it something that wasn't going to pass? Or do you take the half a loaf that you get? I mean, it's really a question between idealism and political pragmatism that a lot of these women are faced with. And, from our perspective, and we were talking about this before, we can't judge them by our viewpoints, our mores in this time, but they had a tough choice.
Absolutely. An additional thing that I'd like to point out is the 19th Amendment was Richard the third real try to get women's suffrage. So we see in the 1870s, there's a bill that's proposed. It languishes for about a decade, waiting if anything's going to happen, ends up defeated. They try again in 1914. It's just defeated outright. And then we finally see the 19th Amendment come through in 1920. So this is something that is a extremely long drawn out process, both legally and just as a citizen, as far as women trying to fight for the right to vote.
And you know what's funny about that? In 1919, when it passes by one vote in the House, and in the Senate, it's voted down, but that comes before the election of 1918 unseats some Democrats and seats some Republicans, so that when they take it back up a second time, that same round, it doesn't pass until then. So, and Wilson is, I think, a really interesting figure here, because originally he was against the whole idea of a federal amendment. He said it's up to the states, which is a way for a president to punt the ball, because he's a Democrat. He is, born and raised in the South, even though he's, governor of New Jersey by that point. But he doesn't want to make any of his white male constituents from the South mad. So he tries to find a way around this, and does so for the longest time. I mean, that's why you've got Paul and her folks out there picketing, saying, Mr. President, how long must women wait for equality, or for liberty? And they end up getting arrested for that. So, he finally reads the tea leaves, I guess you'd say, wouldn't you? And figures out that I'm better on this side of the issue than I am on the other.
Absolutely. And you're talking about some of the legal aspects. Is there are cases that go before the Supreme Court as early as 1875, where we're trying to get the Supreme Court to rule on what should be allowed to vote, whether it's different races and ages and so on. And the Supreme Court just washed their hands of it, much like the presidents were trying to, and basically just said that's not for us to decide. It's not a constitutional issue, and just refused to speak on it.
Yeah, and let me add this about Theodore Roosevelt. When he runs in 1912 as Progressive Party candidate, he is he's one of the, well, I won't say the first, because you've had women's suffrage parties out there, but he, from what might be considered a more mainstream party, is the first one to endorse the idea. Because I think partially because Wilson was against it, Roosevelt was for it.
Richard, do you have anything you want to throw in? I've been kind of leading this for a little bit. We'll take a white male point of view for a little bit.
Well, I do want to mention one of the ways, and because there were a fair number of women, and I don't think we look at this intensely enough. There's a fair number of women who didn't want the vote, who argued that they had more influence indirectly than they did directly. And it's, in some ways it's, from their perspective, understandable, in that these women felt like they would, if they wanted something to happen, they would go to a male that they respected and say, this needs to happen. And sometimes they would see that. And so therefore there was a pretty strong, not overwhelming, but a pretty strong number of women who didn't want to vote. As a matter of fact, in 1920, when they get to vote for the first time, only about a third of eligible women actually vote in that election. And the other thing that I would point out about it is, and this is another male argument, I guess I'm saddled with the male arguments tonight, is that men thought that if women, if you add what right as 50% of the population, if you gave them the right to vote, how might elections swing wildly in ways that you would not be able to control? That's one of the reasons Tammany Hall was so against it up in New York, is they said, well, we got this voting constituency that we understand, and we know how these guys, and it was guys who voted, because a lot of times they voted in saloons and stuff like that. But if you give women the right to vote, we don't understand them. And so therefore, we don't know how they will vote. What we've tended to find out is that in most elections, women vote in about the same proportions for one party or another as men do. We tend to try to look at it, parse it out and try to look at what's the women's vote in the last election and that sort of thing. But generally speaking, it never did swing wildly. It was one of those unfounded things that men were using. And they also argued, and this is, I love this, the craziness of this argument, that men would say, well, since you do have not primaries, but caucuses and that sort of things in bars, if you if women are allowed in, then they're going to be subjected to bar life. And that was just totally unacceptable. Never thinking about the fact of we could hold these in other places, but they never did.
Well, then the flip side of the bar life as well is because so many women who were involved in politics got their start in the prohibition movement. That was another big fear of your bar owners and a lot of your white men, was that if the woman got the right to vote, they would end up losing the ability to go drink. And once again, things that did end up coming true, you know, that's something that we deal with prohibition as well. But that was definitely a real fear, is what's going to change just in my everyday life. I need to be able to go to the bar.
Yeah, luckily for the women's movement, the 18th Amendment came before the 19th.
Yeah.
So you
Yeah.
can't say women getting the right to vote changed that.
Yes, Jenny?
Hence, in the scheme of things, where would you find women were in the bars? Because they were the working women. And so some of the other women did not want to associate with the working woman, or find out that their quote man was in the bar with the working woman.
Think of Miss Kitty and Gunsmoke, if I'm not
That's
going
exactly
too far
right.
back there. But yeah, think
It
Miss
took
Kitty.
years for people to understand that she was, well, okay, she was the madam, the pimp, whatever you want to call her, but that's what she was doing. But I think that made a big change too, because women didn't want to be the higher class women, or in a different social group, did not want to be seen in a bar, because then she would be looked at as a working woman.
But you know, that's an interesting point about the division in the women's movement in that era, in that kind of like with a lot of things, you have a middle and upper class white women contingent, and then you've got working women. And a lot of times they didn't mix because of the whole reputation thing. I mean, progressivism is really all about those upper class women coming up with solutions for the working class.
But they still had the advantage, because the more social women over if they were telling their husband or the man that they looked up to, they still had the intimate power to make something that they want happen, because they had something that the men wanted, married or unmarried. Well, it's true.
Oh, it's true.
Those supporting women.
Well, you know, that's the power that women actually have over men. If you look through history, a lot of it is the power of,
You use what you have when you have it, in some instances.
nicely put.
Whole plays are written about it. Yeah.
Yes, very many.
Yeah. But you know, speaking to that, and the whole idea of the Western aspect of it, you did have people like Dora Dufresne and all those madams who were controlling brothels out west, who had real power, as much as any man in some places.
But the women out west, the one that was most wanted was the laundry lady. because the working women were not the most clean women. And they used to use cow hide, so forth, to make sure that when they were on top, that stayed clean, so they wouldn't have to take it to the laundry woman, because the laundry woman charged more money than the working woman did.
It's
Richard,
what's most important.
And hence the money gave her power, the laundry woman power.
Richard, I might swing us back a little bit closer, and this is something that I'll probably need you to chime in on with me, is to kind of talk a little bit about how the movement was for North Carolina specifically. So it followed a lot of trends throughout the United States, but to my knowledge, we don't really see much happening in North Carolina until Asheville at about the turn of the century. So we were a little bit behind as far as women's suffrage goes compared to the nation. Am I right on that?
Yeah, very much so, because the idea of North Carolina passing the 19th Amendment was completely dead. I mean, we think of North Carolina as being somewhat more progressive than the Deep South, but in this case, it really wasn't. And that's why, you know, our smarter, cuter little brother Tennessee is the one that ends up getting the limelight on this. And that one came down to a very, very close vote. They were expecting to lose. That was the battleground. That was the last place. If it was going to happen, it had to happen there. And so, you can't write this any better. That's why I like history better than fiction, because you can't write this stuff any better than that, of it coming down to 2 votes. One of them, a guy who decided not to was thought to be against it, but decided not to make his vote known until the very end. And then the other from the guy who got the letter from his mother. I can't think of either one of them's name, but the guy who got the letter from his mother who said, "You really should pass this." And that changed his vote.
I love that story. That was absolutely a great story.
Incidentally, the library has a copy or several copies of a book called The Women's Hour, and we had the author Elaine Weiss speak on Zoom last spring, that tells the very entertaining story of that very incident in Tennessee with those legislators and everything that happened, and how it seemed to be hopeless. And then at the last minute, they came through. It's really well written. It reads like it's fiction, but it's better than fiction. Yeah.
Yeah, if you think about it, Tennessee became a real hotbed for debate because, 5 years after that, what have you got? The Scopes Monkey trial, where you're debating traditional views versus the modern world. And so you wouldn't expect it for Tennessee, but I got to hand it to them on those counts.
And I believe that fella whose mom told him, you better pass this thing, and he did. I don't think he ran for re-election. I think it says at the end of that book that he had enough. And so he, turned it in and let somebody else run.
I remember reading about the other guy who didn't make his vote known until the end. They were heckling him when once he made the vote, and they realized that it was going to be, part of the deciding number. So men took a lot of flack from fellow men for standing up for women's rights.
They really did.
Yeah.
And something to keep in mind, and I'm sure we're all aware, is we're talking dates and amendments, but there is a very real faction that goes along with this of whatever an amendment or a law says. There are regions and states who are still instituting poll taxes and literacy tests and things that, even though things might be allowed legally, that does not translate necessarily to the person's ability to actually go vote in their region. And that, of course, ties in for decades on end. That's not something that's limited to the women's suffrage movement. That highly plays into Jim Crow era and the civil rights movement. So that's something that whatever the law says and whatever amendments say do not necessarily always translate to the way things are enacted.
Yeah, I would argue that voting is the toughest of all of those to get it right, because you can violate somebody's rights and it goes to court well after the election's over. Well, it's too late then. You can set a standard for future elections, but the shenanigans that people engage in to keep people from voting, a lot of times, unfortunately, they work.
I think you're muted, Julia. There you go.
Yeah, sorry, question. But did the white women, I don't recall, and you can tell me I'm wrong, I don't recall that the white women had as much trouble once the 19th Amendment was passed as any of the racial issues with, having to read and poll taxes and stuff. I know culturally people weren't excited, some weren't, but I don't recall as much cultural pushback on white women voting.
Where you see it is more getting kind of caught up in the movement. So there, especially with your poor Southern white women, they would have some of the traditional same issues with trying to pass a literacy test as someone who was a person of color. They would have had a lack of education as far as that goes. And so they would just not necessarily be the person who was intended to be prohibited from voting, but they would be caught in the same mechanism.
Okay, thanks.
Richard, you got anything else?
No, not that I can think of. You know how it is. After 10 minutes after this is over, I should have said that. But it has been a, for the most part, once women, I'm shocked at the amazement. I'm shocked at the amount of acceptance that went on right after it, because you would have thought it would have drug on like racial voting. But, in large part, it really didn't. And it almost suggests to me that men knew it was the right thing to do. And once it passes, it's oh, okay. And they just kind of accept it. And, it becomes part and parcel of just how you do things. And it is a bit of an issue with that it gets caught up with race. I think had it not, it probably would have passed sooner. And maybe this just, hopeful conjecturing here, but because it was intertwined for so many years with race because of African-American women, it becomes that kind of political football that nobody wants to step out and embrace it like I would think they probably would have before. I know there was a lot of prejudice against women, a lot of misogyny out there. The whole idea that the word hysterical means of or being like a woman tended to suggest to men that women weren't capable of voting. But in so many ways, women demonstrated, all the way back to the time of Abigail Adams, who tried to get her husband to do something about this and he wouldn't, that women were as capable of men as men to handle the issues of the day. It's just been tradition and, the strength of the male versus the female, physical strength, that really has dictated what the traditions are. And I guess you could, put the Bible, some of the things the Bible says in there about that too. But that, in terms of equality, and, and we're still not there. In so many ways, because what do women make on average versus what men make? About somewhere around 80 cents, something like that, tends to suggest the whole thing isn't over, because 20 years or 40 years after you have women's right to vote, then you have the women's movement that comes along, and so you get these waves every now and then that bring the issue of, just on a practical basis, what inequality looks like back to the forefront, and then we have to deal with it again. Each time, I would argue, because I'm kind of a modernist, that we're getting it right more so with each wave, but it still has not, we have not gone to calm waters on this.
And not to paint kind of a grim picture, but some of these divisions that we talked about between women of color and white women, those we still see an ununified front there as far as women's rights go. I won't get into too much philosophy of, feminism and so on, but we see very different movements throughout the decades, even as recently as the 80s and 90s, of different avenues of advocacy between the two different groups.
Does anybody have any questions for our historians?
No, but thank you very much. For some of us, this is a story we hear again and again, and you try to pick up a few more tidbits each time. So appreciate what you both have shared.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
Harriet's book.
I'm sorry, say that again? Okay?
Can I put in a quick plug for
yes.
Harriet's book? There is a lady that lives in Hickory, out in Viewmont, who just turned 100 last year in April. There was a story in the paper about her having one of these drive-by things where people, celebrated her on her 100th birthday. Well, she had written a poem about women's suffrage, and a friend of hers wanted to do something with it. So she got together. Our school has a publishing arm called Red Hawk Publications. And Gail, and I forget her last name, but she got Harriet's poem, had Bridget Hadley do some drawings of some of the suffragists and some of those scenes from that era. And she put together, along with another lady named Harriet, a curriculum within this book. And we published it with a set of colored pencils on each book so that you could draw, what you think Harriet Stanton Blatch or, any of the suffragettes, Alice Paul, any of them, they looked like. And so we were just over at Viewmont Elementary the other day, and there has been some really kind donors who have bought copies for fifth graders so they could understand this. And so it really all started with that poem. And it's interesting that Harriet, and I forget her last name now, I'm losing everything. Harriet Bannon, that she is 100 years old and was dealing with this 100-year-old subject. She was born in the year that women got the right to vote. And it's a fun book. And eventually what we're hoping to do with it is put a QR code on it so you can hear Harriet read her own poem, and students be able to post things of their learning from it. Because it is one of the, we've seen it happen because we're at the anniversary. You know how we tend to remember anniversary things. But we want this to go forward as an object lesson in what it takes to affect real change in society. So we hope to get a copy down to the library pretty soon, so you guys can come by and take a look at it, and have it for your kids, grandkids, whomever might want to learn something else about this, because it's a really important period of history. In some ways, you could argue it is America's first civil rights crusade. Well before you have racial civil rights, you have gender civil rights, and so we don't want to just drag it out when the anniversary comes. It really needs to be part of the conversation that we have about our history and what it took to get us where we are. And if I had a copy, I'd hold it up, but I don't have a copy with me. So,
Richard, how do you buy that?
So
book?
is it being
Is it
promoted
available?
on the website?
Yeah.
yes, it's at the CVCC website, the bookstore website. We have it there. We have, I think there's some copies over at Tasteful Beans in downtown Hickory. If not, we'll get them. We'll get them there. Unfortunately, or again, fortunately, the book is sold out, but we've got new copies coming, and it's one of those things we love at Red Hawk, in that we've got people buying it as quickly as we can get copies prepared.
What's the title of it again?
Suffragettes.
Suffrage.
Which, that's another thing we didn't talk about, how if you're called a suffragette, that is a slur, because the correct term is suffragist. And a suffragette means you're like, what, junior?
Yeah.
Yeah, you're not a full-fledged person who can argue for your right to vote. But, it's funny. You can insult, when you insult somebody like that and so are so rude about that, the other side, the women here, takes it as a badge of honor and says, look how you've treated us, and we only use that against you men.
Well, the thing about it too, suffragette has a lot more words that rhyme with it than suffragist,
Yeah.
Yes.
So in that sense, it is a very useful word.
Yeah,
It's a lot more marketable.
Yeah, to
Yeah, funny
rhyme.
how it comes in handy like that.
So is that why they picked feminist?
I wonder if that by that era, by the time you get to the 60s and 70s, men were too afraid to try that old thing again of coming up with a nickname for them. Although
I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure.
No.
There are some nicknames, unfortunately. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.
Thank you.